Desert Immigrants by Mario T. Garcia, Chapter 3, Desert Immigrants. While El Paso reflected the economic development of the Southwest in transportation, mining, ranching, and commerce, it also mirrored the great need for cheap labor by Southwestern industries. Employers met much of their labor requirements as in the East and Midwest through migration, initially employing a varied assortment of European, Asian, and Mexican workers. By the turn of the century, Southwestern enterprises relied most exclusively on neighboring Mexico for their supplies of hired hands. Between 1880 and 1920, large numbers of Mexicans entered Southwestern labor markets because of its location as the termination point of Mexican Central. El Paso played a key role in the process and represented the foremost labor supply center in the region. El Paso, the railroads, and other industries contracted thousands of newly arrived Mexican immigrants and transferred them throughout the Southwest, as well as other sections of the country. At the same time, economic changes in Mexico, along with the disruption of the Mexican Revolution 1910-17, forced Mexicans to travel north in search of jobs. The Mexicans' need work complemented the desire by Southwestern enterprises for large supply of cheap, unskilled, and manageable workers. Mexico's limited economic development became the major internal cause for the immigration of Mexicans between 1876 and 1910. During the presidencies of Porfirio Diaz, significant advances took place in railroad construction, mining, and the commercialization of agriculture. In railroad construction, mining, the commercialization of agriculture, oil production, and the establishment of industries, textiles in particular. In this transformation, foreign investments were an indispensable source of capital and technology. The El Paso Times reported on the eve of Diaz's downfall in 1910 that the total amount of capital investment in Mexico between 1866 and 1906 had been more than 2 billion pesos. Foreign capital represented almost 70% of it. Americans invested in railroads, mines, ranches, farms, and other concerns prior to 1910. These investments, along with the European ones, helped to stimulate sustained economic growth in Mexico under Diaz, whose open invitation to foreign capital made Mexico, according to a contemporary slogan, quote, the mother of foreigners and the stepmothers of Mexicans, unquote. Mexico's economic growth led many observers to see a new era of order and progress, for it as a result of Diaz's leadership. Quote, our sister Republic of Mexico stands upon the threshold of the dawning century, the Houston Post commented in 1900. With wonderful social, political, and industrial development to its credit, unquote. The Post believed that the railroads, modern business methods, expanded industries, and modernization of the legal and educational system constituted the foundation for Mexico's economic takeoff. Yet Mexican policy, which in theory worshipped industrial gods, in practice left the ageless hacienda in control of the countryside. Its tentacles nearly everywhere in rural Mexico until 1910 displaced the rural population due to changes in land tenure. Before Diaz, the communal villages had characterized the densely populated central regions. However, between 1876 and 1910, Diaz and his henchmen in office sanctioned the theft of village lands by wealthy haciendos, meant to encourage foreign investment in order to stimulate exports in such items as cotton, coffee, and henequen. Diaz's land policy proved disastrous to dirt farmers as haciendas and at times foreigners acquired public lands. Previously communal properties, ejidos, owned by campesinos, one estimate places the number of dirt farmers who lost communal lands at 5 million. Moreover, a growing population, the result of improved health measures, served to exacerbate land shortages and rural poverty between 1875 and 1910. Mexico's total population multiplied by more than 50%. Diaz's short-sighted policy and the population explosion left a large class of landless rural laborers eager to move north to find jobs in industry, agriculture, and mines in the lightly populated provinces of northern Mexico. Mobility characterized this new worker. He not only could find employment on the cotton or cattle haciendas, but when he needed to, he could work in railroad construction and maintenance or in the mines as a manual labor. Clearly, the jobless went in search of work and better wages. Chihuahua and Sonora, for example, paid among the highest wages in Mexico. By 1900, a common laborer earned about 88 cents U.S. in Ciudad compared to 23 cents U.S. in Mexico's interior. But nevertheless, across the border, similar work in Texas paid $1 a day. Eventually, owing to the 1907 recession in Mexico and the Mexican Revolution of 1910, when much unemployment occurred, many workers crossed the border into the United States. A sample of World War I draft registration cards for El Paso reveals that the majority of 72% of Mexican immigrants were born in northern Mexican states, especially Chihuahua. The governor of Arizona, commenting on increased Mexican immigration to his state in 1907, observed that high wages in the mines, smelters, railroads, and ranches tempted Mexicans to leave their homeland. The opportunities for jobs that had produced the migration of landless workers to Mexico's northern borderlands motivated the first great wave of the Mexican immigrants to the United States. It is difficult to determine the exact number of Mexicans entering the United States between 1880 and 1920 because immigration officials did not keep adequate records for every Mexican who crossed the border. Moreover, it appeared that many Mexicans crossed and recrossed the frontier several times due to seasonal employment. In the United States, in a 1912 article, Samuel Bryan, writing for the survey, noted that until 1908, immigration figures on Mexicans are so obviously incomplete as to be of little value. Many also crossed illegally at various points along the lengthy and unguarded desert boundary. Table 3.1 lists official immigration figures from 1894 to 1920. Although showing increased immigration, the data represents smaller figures than those published by El Paso newspapers. Furthermore, Mexican immigration records reveal a much higher volume of migration, in some cases more than double the American numbers for a given year. The 1930 census, the first to record a category for Mexicans, estimated that the Mexican population of the United States grew from 367,510 in 1910 to 700,541 in 1920. Although these figures did not include illegals or those counted as whites, between the turn of the century and the start of the Great Depression, more than 1 million Mexicans arrived. Owing its proximity to the border and economic boom, Texas received more than half the Mexican immigrants. Many of them entered the United States through El Paso via the Mexican Central Railroad. Probably more Mexican laborers enter the United States through El Paso. An American government official reported in 1908 than cross the border either east or west of that city. Charles Armijo, who arrived in El Paso with his family in 1910, remembers that a fare on the Mexican Central did not cost much. Available information, however, indicates that railroad passage to the border from central Mexico was between 10 and 15 American dollars, undoubtedly causing some hardship on immigrants from the interior. Large numbers found jobs in El Paso and added to the border city's population growth. By 1920, the El Paso had the second largest, next to San Antonio, Mexican population of any American city, and was the only major southwestern metropolis with more Mexicans than Americans. Mexicans immigrated to the United States in two definable periods, between 1880 and the conclusion of World War I. This first included unrestricted movement across the border up to 1917. The second involved immigration, limited work in specific industries as a result of the Immigration Act of 1917. Until that year, the only Mexicans who could not enter the country were the physically and mentally handicapped paupers, beggars, all persons not capable of earning a living, convicted criminals, polygamists, anarchists, and prostitutes. Since 1885, immigration officials also had prohibited contract labor. Even under the 1907 Immigration Act, immigrants from Mexico did not have to pay a head tax or any other entrance fee, causing a Times reporter to remark that Mexicans can come in easier than any other class of immigrants. Armijo recalls that immigrants could enter and leave without passports and whenever they pleased. According to El Paso historian Cleophas Coloros, who arrived with his family at the turn of the century, all you had to do coming from Mexico, if you were a Mexican citizen, was to report at the immigration office on the American side, give your name, the place of your birth, and where you were going to. During the 1890s, Mexicans entering in smaller numbers did not cause any considerable notice or alarm. In 1894, a Mexican newspaper in El Paso, El Defensor, commented that the availability of work had promoted the immigration of Mexicans. Railroads, or trucks, as the Mexicans called them, operating along the border between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, contracted almost all their manual labors. In El Paso, the Arizona Silver Belt editorialized in 1898 that railroad construction crews in Arizona consisted mainly of Mexicans and Indians. It is difficult to get white men to work, the editor wrote, the wages being only $1.50 a day and board $5 per week, with some minor charges which reduce a man's net earnings, unquote. The employment of Mexican railroad workers in the border city increased the prosperity of local merchants. Since most of the workers' families lived in El Paso, and in turn economic expansion reinforced the city's attraction for new immigrants, El Defensor also observed that some of the immigrants entered the United States illegally by walking across the often dry Rio Grande at El Paso. According to one early immigrant, the railroads did not allow Mexican employees to take their families with them on the job. However, after a laborer had worked at least 6 months, the railroads provided free transportation for his family to the job location. Those who left families in El Paso or Mexico received 3-week passes to visit their wives and children every 6 months. The Dillingham Commission, established by the United States Senate to investigate immigrant conditions throughout the country, calculated from data acquired from 9 Western railroads between 1907 and 1909, that 58.2% of the wives of Mexican railroad laborers lived in the United States. No other immigrant railroad workers in the West, such as Southern Europeans and Asians, could match this figure. And the commission suggested, although without evidence, that the conditions under which section hands live are less uninviting to the Mexican women than to the women of any other race. By 1910, one railroad line, the Santa Fe, encouraged the migration of Mexican families in order to stabilize the line's workforce. As one Santa Fe engineer put it, hiring a married man produced a better trained and steadier class of laborers, unquote. As more immigrants with their families arrived during the first decade of the new century, concern began over the flow of Mexicans into El Paso. The chief of Bureau of Immigration in El Paso, General Malloy, told the Times in 1902 that for several months, quote, hordes of Mexicans of every age have been pouring over the border, seeking the benefits of the United States citizenship, unquote. According to Malloy, during the month of May, an unusually large number of Mexicans entered. In 1 week, between 400 and 500 Mexicans had been admitted and an average of $250 per day had made applications for admissions. Malloy noted that even boys and old men and women could be found among the immigrants, and that labor contractors herded the Mexicans and transported them to be used as cheap labor in railroad grading camps. The Mexican consulate confirmed Malloy's statement, and its secretary commented that immigration had occurred because of a drought in Mexico, forcing many farmers and campesinos to leave Mexico and enter the United States in search of work. 1 year later, the El Paso Medical Association complained that unrestricted immigration of Mexican peons had caused a potential health problem for El Paso as well as the whole country. It recommended rigid enforcement of federal immigration laws for a period of 12 months in order to protect the United States against the bubonic plague striking Mexico. We understand well enough, unquote, a spokesman for the association stated, that half a dozen government inspectors cannot prevent poor Mexicans from crowding into the country. The association believed that the most objectionable class of Mexicans did not cross over the international bridges, but illegally waded across the Rio Grande to prevent the illegal entrance of paupers and the diseased. It called upon state, territorial, and city officers to serve as immigration inspectors. The sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, constables, and policemen, unquote, the association's representatives stressed, would detect the stranger and they could be escorted back to the Mexican side of the line, unquote. The association further urged a 1-year ban on Mexican peon immigration. No such restriction was placed on, and 4 years later, the Times reported that in the 1906 fiscal year, 32,465 immigrants had arrived in El Paso, a gain of 7,575 over fiscal 1905. Of those admitted, 31,358 were Mexicans. 20 Mexicans came to the United States for every American who went to Mexico. A Mexican newspaper in El Paso pointed out 1 year later that 22,000 Mexican men between the ages of 19 and 45 had crossed into El Paso during 1906. They came because of oppression at the hands of the haciendos and caciques, political bosses, who forced them to work for almost nothing. Quote, "It is only natural," the newspaper El Paso del Norte emphasized, "that the supreme law of necessity obliges with all these people to immigrate to a foreign land in search of higher wages and better treatment." El Paso newspapers printed various other accounts of Mexican immigration to El Paso prior to the Mexican Revolution. In September 1907, for example, the Times reported that 400 Mexican laborers had been admitted by local immigration officials. These workers had arrived in Ciudad Juarez on 2 Mexican Central trains on a Friday, and by the next day had crossed into El Paso. These immigrants appear at the border in sombreros serape, and sandals, observed one federal official, quote, which before crossing the river they usually exchange for a suit of American clothing, shoes, and a less conspicuous hat. The Dillingham Commission noted the increased migration and employment of Mexican labor in the Southwest. The Senate investigating body estimated that Mexicans represented 17.1% of all common laborers employed in the maintenance of way departments of 9 western and southwestern railroads. Most of the Mexicans worked close to the border. Of the railroads examined, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific hired the majority of Mexicans. Out of its 2,672 common laborers, the Santa Fe engaged 2,599 Mexicans. One historian has suggested that many Mexicans chose to work for the Santa Fe because of the religious symbol of the railroad's name conveyed. The Southern Pacific employed 2,714 Mexicans in a workforce of 12,592 laborers. However, the bulk of the Mexicans toiled in the railroad's Southwest Division. Quote, the number of Mexican section hands employed in the western states, unquote, the commission emphasized, has more than doubled since 1900, in spite of the fact that roads, e.g. the Rock Island operating in other states, have begun to employ them and are paying higher wages. According to the Senate report, although Mexicans had displaced other groups of cheap labor, such as the Chinese and Japanese, the new immigrant workers formed an additional source of low-paid labor. From its data, the commission revealed that the railroads paid Mexican workers only $1 a day, except for a short period before 1907 when they received $1.25 a day. Senator Dillingham's commission concluded that railroads like the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific preferred Mexicans because they possessed more physical strength than the Japanese, yet were known for their tractability and, quote, passive obedience. In addition, Mexicans are easily satisfied and there is no fear of concerted action by them, unquote. During the Mexican Revolution, political as well as economic immigrants came to El Paso. Hundreds of political refugees, both rich and poor, fled Mexico to escape persecution by the different warring factions. Prior to Francisco Madero's capture of Ciudad Juarez in May 1911, for example, the large number of Mexicans from the strategic border town and surrounding region fled to safety in El Paso, including many young men escaping impressment into Diaz's army. Quote, the hotels and rooming houses of the city are filled with the families of Juarez's most exclusively social circles. One observer reported 2 years later that as civil war erupted once again after Madero's assassination, more political refugees found a haven on the border city. A Times correspondent witnessing the entrance of 500 refugees remarked that most were women and children from the wealthiest families in Chihuahua. Arriving at the age of 9 with his parents and 3 brothers and sisters, Jesus Moreno later remembered that, quote, there were a lot of people coming to the city, El Paso, because of the revolution. We came to the United States to wait out the conclusion of the revolution. We thought it would be over in a few months, unquote. The largest and most controversial influx of political refugees occurred in January 1914. Following the defeat of the Mexican federal troops at Ojinaga on the Texas-Coahuila border southeast of El Paso, thousands of federales and their camp's followers fled to Presidio, Texas, to escape capture at the hands of Francisco Pancha Villa. Once the fugitives were in American territory, United States military forces captured them under an 1899 international convention governing belligerent troops crossing into neutral country. Unable to provide adequately for their care in Presidio, however, officials transferred the refugee army, totaling more than 5,000, to Fort Bliss on the outskirts of El Paso. General Hugh L. Scott, the commander of the base, attempting to calm fears that the detainment of such large numbers would cause disease or social disorders, assured the city council that the Mexicans had been vaccinated and would be closely guarded in a tent camp surrounded by wire fences and electric lights. To assuage local discontent, the general further pointed out that over $1,000 a day in provisions would have to be purchased from El Paso merchants to maintain the camp. Unconvinced by Scott, Americans expressed alarm and anger at having to host the Mexican refugees. One El Paso physician, in a letter to the Times, warned against the dangers to public health and morals from what he considered the unsanitary and immoral nature of the female camp followers. They are aliens, civilians, indigenous, unhygienic, and liable to become public charges, unquote. He emphasized, in fact, are obnoxious to every law governing the admission of aliens into the United States, unquote. Another El Pasoan complained that Mexicans, whether refugees or not, did not appreciate American charity and generosity. Consequently, the United States had no obligation to take care of those fleeing from their own civil war. Quote, I cannot understand what the United States is coming to, J.C. Jarvis wrote, when it allows a foreign disturbing element to come into this country and break all the laws and go unpunished as they do in El Paso, unquote. Furthermore, one American failed to comprehend why the United States allowed refugees into the country when so many Mexicans already had glutted the local labor market, causing unemployment among Americans. Finally, one letter writer to the Times, signing himself as, quote, declared that the refugees endangered El Paso peace because most of them supported Maduro's assassin. General Victoriana Huerta argued that anti-federal forces led by Villa would undoubtedly retaliate against El Paso if the refugees posed a threat. The refugees, he concluded, were a menace, reinforcing such fears. The American consul in Ciudad Juarez suspected imprisoned Mexican officers of directing revolutionary plots along the border and suggested to the State Department that 200 or 300 of them be removed from El Paso. However, the Times urged patience and goodwill. In an editorial entitled Refugees Welcomed, the border publication reminded El Pasoans that in earlier, more peaceful days, Mexicans arriving to patronize city stores had been a welcome sight and compromised a significant group of consumers. Refugees, the paper contended, continued to be important shoppers as well as law-abiding residents, astutely recognizing the economic value of the Mexican population to El Paso's fortunes. The Times concluded by calling for racial harmony. The Times is glad to have this opportunity to voice as it feels it does voice the practicality, unanimous judgment of the intelligent and hospitable people of El Paso, that the presence of this large number of the citizens of Mexico is not a menace, but a source of prosperity and happiness to the people of the city, unquote. The Times attempted to alleviate further tensions by publishing accounts indicating that sanitary and peaceful conditions existed in the refugee camp at Fort Bliss. Reporter Julia A. Sharp wrote one piece suggesting that Americans should be neither concerned nor sentimental about the refugees, including the women and children. Not only were they used to harsh conditions, but they had a number of conveniences. Sharp informed her readers that Army officials provided the Mexican with sufficient food, clothing, medical care, and shelter. She indicated that some children had no clothes, but that this caused no problem because the majority of children in Mexico, ages 2 to 5, were accustomed to having no clothes. Hence, El Pasoans need not worry about them. The fact that these children possessed no clothes during cold desert days in January did not appear to bother reporter Sharp either. She also expressed an opinion on the hardiness of the female camp followers. What would be death to an American woman, Sharp subjectively stated, is an appetizer to the class of Mexican women found at Fort Bliss. And while our sympathies to go out to the mother weeping over the death of her little one, or to the wife sorrowing for a husband lost in battle, we must take into consideration that it is their own fight and not ours, that we did not send women trailing over the desert wastes, and last and not least, that we could not prevent them going, even if they were offered good homes, unquote. Whether concerned or not, El Pasoans were relieved of the refugees in April when officials transported them to Fort Wingate in southern New Mexico. A few months later, the American government released the non-commissioned officers, privates, and camp followers who returned to Mexico during the brief existence of the Fort Bliss refugee camp. 5,296 Mexicans had been detained, including 1,237 women and 532 children. Despite the political character of many immigrants, between 1910 and 1920, most Mexicans arrived seeking jobs, not political sanctuary. Although the Civil War at times made it difficult to leave the country, the Times observed in 1911 that for 2 months there had been a decrease in the number of Mexican immigrants through El Paso. F.W. Berkshire, the chief of immigration inspectors in the city, stated that for the previous 3 or 4 years, there had been an average of 2,000 Mexican immigrants per month in El Paso from February to May. They came to work on the railroads of the Southwest, but not one Mexican had entered since January due to the breakdown of the train communication between El Paso and the Mexican interior caused by the revolution. Yet by the late spring, the Mexican interior caused by the revolution. Yet by the late spring, Mexican Central resumed operations and more than 1,000 Mexican laborers arrived during the first days of June. Once the Mexicans were admitted, contractors immediately sent them to work in Arizona and California railroad camps. The Times further noted that every train that arrived in Juarez during June brought about 300 men to work on railroad section gangs. In the Southwest, in 1914, the Times reported that a horde of strange Mexicans had been discovered wandering through South El Paso, bordering the river. Policemen found about 300 Mexicans camped in an alley who stated they were farmers from the vicinity of Mexico City and that they had left their homes because of the revolution. They informed the Times that another 700 campañeros remained in Juarez but would cross the border in the next few days. Most of the men said they had left their families in Mexico while they came to the United States looking for jobs. After only 1 day in El Paso, the majority of these immigrants had been shipped out by employment offices to work on New Mexico railroads. Years later, a St. Louis labor contractor observed that Mexicans in the United States often received new jobs through several channels in restaurants, barbershops, pool halls, hotels, labor offices for merchants, correspondence from other Mexicans in railroad camps, from Mexican newspapers in the United States, and in some cases, one Mexican would leave a railroad camp to bring other workers back with him. As increased fighting broke out in the north-central parts of Mexico between 1914 and 1916, Thousands of Mexicans entered El Paso. In one June week in 1916, immigration officials admitted 4,850 Mexicans into the city. American miners forced to leave Torreon reported that officers of General Venustiano Carranza's army granted free transportation to El Paso to families along the route of the Mexican Central. Torreon and other towns of the area had become short of food and little or no work could be found. Felix Urdiales, who lived in Juarez at the time, recalled that farm production had ceased in northern Mexico, resulting in widespread hunger. The El Paso Herald received reports in August of people dying of hunger in Zacatecas and Torreon, and the Reverend Jose Marquez, who directed charity activities in Juarez, stated that 200 destitute men, women, and children arrived in the Mexican border city every week from the interior. Observing that many Mexican immigrants remained in El Paso to glut the labor markets and keep down wages, the survey also commented on their depressed conditions. Refugees before one band of the marauders, after another, homeless, poverty-stricken, chronically hungry, alien in speech, manners, habits, and ideas, they have proved a heavy burden for so young a community as El Paso to carry. For El Paso, gateway to Mexico, has found its wickets opening since Diaz fell. And El Paso, like New York, gets more than its share of the weak among incoming aliens. The large movement of Mexicans into El Paso caused officials to fear a major epidemic. To prevent it, all Mexicans who crossed the border, whether immigrants or residents of Juarez who worked in El Paso, had to receive vaccinations against typhus in order not to offend the Juarez commuters. The Herald pointed out that they did not represent the source of the health hazard. The problem, according to the paper, did not consist of the productive and sober men and women who worked in El Paso and lived in Juarez, but in the migrants from Mexico's interior who arrived in poverty and poor health. In addition to vaccinations, the city health department inspected all areas of Chihuahua, the largest Mexican district in El Paso and adjacent to the border. For any contagious disease, a room-to-room search uncovered no such problems, but the inspectors burned all rags and bedding infested with lice. Immigration officials also increased their surveillance of illegal entrants and captured large numbers of Mexicans who smuggled themselves across the river. Captain L.L.A. Hall of the El Paso Police Department emphasized the problem at a Rotary Club luncheon in March and warned that the city faced a severe crisis because 2,000 Mexican immigrants desired to enter El Paso, but the city customs and immigration officials could not cope with these numbers. Many had already crossed illegally downriver from Washington Park in the city's eastern section and upriver from the cement plant in the western part of El Paso. He announced that assistance had been requested of General John Pershing's troops, then stationed in the city, but the Pershing, lacking instructions from Washington, refused. By June 1916, the problem became worse, and U.S. immigration officers at the Santa Fe Bridge connecting El Paso with Ciudad Juarez began turning back hundreds of Mexicans. The immigrants had to pass rigorous physical examinations, which many failed. Despite these rejections, Mayor Tom Lee of El Paso cautioned that unless these strict entrance requirements continued, he would be forced to declare a quarantine against Mexican immigration. The danger of the spread of typhus had become too great to take chances. The mayor stated, hence the hundreds of Mexicans seeking entry to El Paso had to be considered a health menace and kept out. A quarantine did not have to be enforced, and immigration authorities reported that not one case of typhus or any other dangerous disease had been found among 2,000 immigrants who entered El Paso in 3 days. They observed that no more than 1,500 who remained in Ciudad Juarez desired to enter the country. Quote, the large numbers of Mexicans that are asking for admission to the United States are apparently healthy, in good physical condition, and some are not wholly destitute, unquote, said the supervising inspector at the International Bridge. Quote, some say they have not had anything to eat for several days, unquote. Nevertheless, continued reports of typhus and smallpox in Zacatecas and Aguascalientes made El Paso officials consider a quarantine until a danger abated by year's end. By then, the special El Paso population census taken in 1916 reported that out of a total population of 51,898, Mexicans represented 52%, or 32,724 people. In addition, 7,051 refugees, almost all Mexicans, resided in the city. The Immigration Act of 1917 temporarily reduced the movement of Mexicans into the United States. Although its literacy test and $8 head tax had been intended to restrict Europeans, it also affected Mexican immigration. The number of Mexicans who entered in 1917 dropped to 25,000, nearly half the figure for the previous year. Moreover, although as aliens they could not be subjected to American conscription laws, many Mexicans returned to their homeland during World War I for fear of being drafted. This decline, in addition to war manpower shortages, led employers in El Paso and the Southwest to complain of a lack of labor. The Herald reported a dearth of Mexican workers at a time when the region badly needed railroad, farm, and factory laborers. Instead, Mexicans had started to return to Mexico at the rate of $100 a day. Out of fear of ignorance of the new immigration law, and the Los Angeles Times warned of a serious exodus with a particular dire consequences for agricultural and ranching interests along the Texas border. Even El Paso housewives felt the effect of the restrictions because of the law barred Mexican servants who could neither read nor write from employment, forcing many housewives to do their own work. Opposed to these regulations, the Executive Committee of the Arizona Council of Defense requested its state representatives in Congress to seek a suspension of the literacy test and head tax provisions in order to facilitate immigration from Mexico. The council claimed that the railroads of southern Arizona needed 5,000 laborers and that the shortage could total 16,500 within a year. It believed that the maintenance of the railroads should be considered a military priority and entitled to Mexican workers. Besides the railroads, other Arizona industries insisted that they needed Mexican unskilled labor, especially the farm of the Salt River Valley, who desired hands for the harvest of grain, alfalfa, cotton, and other crops. The mines also reported a shortage of labor. Mexico is therefore the country to which Arizona must look for unskilled labor, unquote, asserted the Herald in an editorial supporting the Arizona Council. The El Paso paper affirmed the council's contention that both the literacy test and the head tax represented an effective barrier against men desiring jobs in the United States. California farm growers concurred, and according to a member of the California Fruit Growers Exchange, in the 1917 restrictions threatened to create a worker shortage for the Southern California harvest. The demand by Southwestern economic interest for liberal immigration laws constituted a traditional request by American industries, especially in good times. The efforts of the Arizona Council succeeded, as well as those of agricultural interest groups. Throughout the Southwest, the Department of Labor announced in June 1917 that the immigration law would be suspended in part to allow Mexican laborers to enter for agricultural work. According to the decree, the Secretary of Labor waived the literacy test, the $8 head tax, and the 1885 prohibition of contract labor. The Herald praised this decision but noted a serious flaw in the suspension. This leaves the railroads out in the cold, the paper stated, and they are most in need of men. It observed that one line alone estimated an immediate need for 5,000 laborers. Other southwestern employers also reported a desire for Mexicans. The Herald believed that it might not be too late for the Secretary of Labor to modify his position to include more industries employing Mexican workers, and that perhaps they could be shifted from one area to another, wherever the demand greatest, for instance, it pointed out. At one time, it might be desirable to have a large number of Mexicans available for the cotton picking. At another time, they might not be needed on the farm, but would be in demand in the section gangs on the railroads. At still another, the mines and the smelters might be in need of ordinary labor and secure some hundreds or even thousands of men from the railroads and farms. Although the Department of Labor did not immediately extend the suspension in August, the Herald reported that the first positive results of the waiver could be seen in the movement of trainloads of Mexicans to sugar beet factories in California and cotton fields in Arizona. It further believed that the suspension had already proved to be a blessing for both for American farmers and for the Mexican, many of whom had lost their jobs due to the shutdown of copper mines and smelters in Sonora. The Herald emphasized that the waiver helped alleviate the region's labor shortages. Despite the entrance of agricultural workers, total immigration from Mexico declined during 1917 because of the immigration law. J.B. Gwynn, the secretary of the Associated Charities of El Paso, observed some results of new restrictions. Mexicans who applied at an employment agency now had to present an immigration card to show they had been legally admitted, yet the enforcement of the law led to an increase of illegal crossings, especially below Isleta, a few miles down the river from El Paso, where some persons hauled Mexicans in boats to the American side, charging 50 cents per person. Gwynn believed that the decline in immigration had made Chihuahua a healthier place to live, since the law kept, quote, the worst class of Mexicans out, unquote. Although he observed that the application of the literacy test had been made as lenient as possible, all applicants for admission at the El Paso port of entry had to read 20 lines in the Bible in some language. On the other hand, immigration officials strictly enforced the head tax provision. Finally, those admitted had to be bathed in their clothes and baggage sterilized by immigration authorities. A reporter noted that inspectors used gas to disinfect baggage, since normal steam cleaning would ruin the contents. According to Felix Urdales, who obtained a passport to enter the United States, at the time border officials, including contingent of Texas Rangers stationed at El Paso, also required Mexican commuter workers from Ciudad Juarez to be bathed every 8 days. In exchange for a bath, commuters received a receipt certifying they had been cleaned that day. Persistent demands by the railroads and mines for Mexican labor resulted in an 1918 amendment to the immigration law of the previous year. The amendment extended the waiver to Mexicans entering to work in railroad maintenance and coal mining. These aliens could remain in the United States no longer than the duration of the war and had to secure employment before crossing. In addition, employers had to file job applications with immigration authorities at the port of entry. Laborers admitted under the amendment received identification cards and labor contractors employing them had to be responsible for their transportation to the place of work. George J. Howe, chief inspector at the port of El Paso, predicted that the new modifications would bring immediate relief from labor shortages in the Southwest. However, the Herald reported a week later that no dramatic increase in Mexican immigration had occurred. It believed that many laborers in Mexico desired to work in the United States, but the ignorance of the new waiver held many back. Apparently, some Mexicans did not hesitate. For Tom Bell, the deputy commissioner of the Texas Labor Department, commented that the efforts of his office and other agencies to recruit Mexicans to pick the cotton crop had met with success. According to Bell, the Mexican workers arrived in El Paso at the rate of 90 per day and were shipped out as fast as possible to the interior of the state. Some of them went to Colorado and California to work in the sugar beet industry, where Bell asserted they had been assured of good wages and wholesome food. By July 1918, the number of Mexican immigrants entering El Paso had definitely increased. Although demand still exceeded the supply of W.H. Robb, the senior examiner of the United States Employment Service, on a visit to El Paso, observed that 500 laborers had arrived in Juarez, but had to wait while American officials took their photographs and filled out forms before the Mexicans could cross the border. These procedures took too much time. The Times complained, at a moment when employers immediately needed workers to compound matters, other areas of the country expressed an interest in the Mexicans. Representatives of the Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, arrived in El Paso. I'm so sorry. My book fell. Okay, sorry about that. For example, arrived in El Paso and reported that they could use several thousand laborers. The desire for Mexican workers seemed inexhaustible. During 1918, Texas farm groups maintained that the suspension of the 1917 law did not provide sufficient laborers and requested that all restrictions on Mexican immigration be dropped. In San Antonio, a July conference of Texas officials and agricultural interests petitioned Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson to lift for 90 days the immigration law for Mexican labor. The conference reported that South Texas farmers required 40,000 Mexicans. The Herald supported the San Antonio meeting and stressed the acute labor shortages in Texas and the Southwest due to the war effort. Because of its seasonal nature, agriculture felt this shortage more than other enterprises, and the Herald pointed out that in some southwestern areas, women had to work in the fields, helping with slender muscles but stout hearts to do the work for which there is an efficiency of men. Unquote. It emphasized the lack of laborers for mines, factories, and offices in the region, and that even these concerns had to employ boys and elderly men. A great service could be rendered, the Herald concluded, if Washington would waive all restrictions against Mexican labor with the exception of health and wartime measures. The request did not meet the approval of federal officials, although they did extend the waiver to include Mexican working in any type of mining or as common laborers in federal construction projects, affecting only Immigration District Number 23, covering Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The latest order from the Department of Labor, the Herald noted, would relieve labor shortages at some extent. The paper claimed that military aviation fields and army camps in Texas had been in urgent need of annual workers. The Arizona copper mines suffered from a lack of Mexicans, and the railroads found it difficult to maintain an adequate workforce for the section of gangs whose groups of houses dot the desert from here to Los Angeles. The end of the war terminated the special exemptions of the 1917 immigration law, yet Southwestern industries still insisted they would be seriously hurt if the waiver did not continue. Sympathetic to their interests, the Labor Department ruled that employers who had contracts for Mexican laborers prior to December 15, 1918, could import until January 15, 1919. The regulation permitted Mexican laborers in agriculture and on the railroads, in government construction work, and in the mines to remain in the United States until they were no longer needed or their contracts expired. Moreover, persistent pressure by these industries kept these exemptions in force until 1921. The survival of the suspensions after the war meant that the economy of the Southwest continued to be supplied with cheap Mexican labor, despite earlier declarations that the waiver had been only a wartime necessity. The Immigration Bureau announced that twice as many Mexicans entered the United States during fiscal 1919 than in any previous year since 1900. In view of the increase, some immigration officers expressed doubts about the Southwest's lack of unskilled labor. Indeed, the 1920s would witness an even larger immigration and importation of Mexicans until the 1929 Depression put a stop to it. This is the end of Chapter 3, Part 1. Thank you.